Thank you. In trying to prepare this talk, I think I found this probably one of the most difficult talks I've ever had to prepare. In such a short time, it's a simple but very complicated subject, especially for people like me who are not foresters. Dormice do live in and make use of conifers. They're different. Conifers appear in the woodland landscape patchwork in a variety of ways across a wide range of situations. Underneath many conifer canopies, it may be completely dark, be completely devoid of broadleaves, heavily grazed by stock or deer, to which we will return, or have patches that are open, full of shrubs and lots of edges. In all of those situations, I have personally come across dormice. Whilst managing for dormice, which is the very awkward subject of this talk, rather than managing in the presence of dormice, you'll be following a broadly similar theme to those people managing woodlands, principally for economic timber returns, whilst using large harvesting machinery and at the same time keeping within the EU and UK legislation, which is slightly different at the moment in England and Wales, just to make things helpful. But what is different is the costs of doing this work will be very much higher, probably, for you, unless you can use your wonderful volunteer groups that some of you have demonstrated today, and the lack of profit will be huge. But it does allow you to do micromanagement of the conifer habitat, which probably is the best possible option if you can. So, background on conifers. About 1 million hectares of woodland in England, I'm not talking about Wales here, in England, about 55,000 woodlands. We currently, I believe, have 2,200 and something or other individual dormouse records, show an awful lot of woodlands where we don't know whether dormice exist at all. Half of the woodlands are broadleaf, or half the area is broadleaf, 40% is conifer, and for comparison, the amount of coppice is minute, and that's the traditional area where historically people thought dormice only existed, for quite reasonable reasons. 90% of the timber used in the UK is softwood, conifers. 90% of that is imported. So we have a situation that we need conifers economically in Britain on probably a 60-year cycle for sake of argument. But also conifer forests do have specialist biota as well in their own right. So we have to think of those sometimes. In the 50s, 60s and 70s, as Pat rightly said today, when the numbers of reports in county records was going down, they were planting up to 50, 60,000 hectares of conifers a year, having either taken out broadleaves or starting from scratch on farmland sites, upland farmland sites often. And there is a policy by government to replace about 80,000 hectares of conifers in what we call ancient woodland sites. And that's where I was originally employed to do. So we have a problem of long-term decline with habitat fragmentation. I suspect that the increase in conifers of 250,000 hectares over 50 years probably didn't help, but certainly we didn't look. And a lack of management of all woodlands, especially conifers, if dormice are found. Most of your sites, if I had time I'd ask, most of your sites people find a dormouse, they think they're going to put up a box keep, don't let anybody cut a tree down. That's probably, and definitely in conifers, the worst possible management option. Conifer forest operations have got larger, faster, and often what we call cleaner. You take out all the broadleaves as you're trying to encourage your conifers. Not very good for dormice. So, medium to long-term impacts of this type of operation, affecting both the food supply and the refuge, which probably are critical for dormice. So variables in terms of conifers, so I can't give you all the answers of all conifers in 20 minutes. We've got about 10 main conifer species and another 10 that are quite important. You can go from 100% plantations of conifers to less than 10% in mixtures. You've got different size of blocks, you've got ages of conifers, you've got an entire wood or a block, you've got linking conifers that link to what might be jolly good dormice sites, but it's only conifers between the two. You've got a previous management history that could actually be really awful for dormice, or no management at all, and you've got ancient woodland sites. So they're all parameters in the mix of what do we do to manage woodlands, conifer woodlands for dormice. So we might think of a chap with a chainsaw and a volunteer gang going in here doing some light removal of trees. When you come to economic forestry in conifers, you're back to this scenario. These machines each cost £250,000. Somebody has to pay the interest, even though interest rates appear to be low when you're saving at the moment. They're having to cut several hundred tons a day just to pay for the machine, let alone the wages of the operator. So you can't hang around, you can't be picky. And they cost often £500 each to bring onto your site to do some work, and then £500 each to take away afterwards. So we're talking about serious amounts of money for economic forestry. If you can do it all with a few saws, that's great. So back to do dormice use conifers. We have this problem with the big machines of the European legislation, and there are a couple of people from Natural England who may help you with legislation questions later, I hope. The Minister is allowed to provide a pragmatic best practice to get round the problem that if you fell 2 trees, you could kill 2 dormice, in which case you're, in theory, breaking the law. So do they use conifers? The first piece of work I did and sent to Tony Mitchell-Jones is we found 120 sites, FC sites with conifers that we had records of dormice in. We then set up 20 sites around the country here with 50 boxes in. And over a period of years, 4 years, we found out of our 20 sites, 45, 55, 65, 75% of our 20 sites came up with dormice, but not in the first year, sometimes 4 years. And on an annual basis, you had about a 55% chance with 50 boxes of coming across evidence of dormice, whether it's a nest, whether it's 1 or 101 animals. Just to give you the context. We had them in Sitka spruce, in grand fir, with 120 fallow deer grazing underneath, and about 8/10 rhododendron, a nominal conifer. We know about the sequential specialist feeder that they are, but those of you who know their pollen grains, this is a Corsican pine pollen grain found in our dormice at Wire Forest in large quantities. Are they living in conifers? Well, there's a day nest in a cascade of needles, as I called it, and here is another nest from the conifers. No doubt that's in the conifers. Here we've got hibernation nests, there, and without literally hand searching, literally inch by inch, there's no way you'd come across those. Radio tracking is the key to those. So, unlikely to find dormice in that sort of landscape, not enough woodland, lots of woolly maggots, unfortunately, which don't do anything for understory at all. Find dormice in this type of situation, even in sort of mid-upland Wales, where the nest boxes are always wet. Here's a conifer forest you wouldn't believe. Look at the ground story there. We marked 40 dormice in that. Here's regrowth after cutting an area of woodland. Here's a pre-thicket stage which was planted with pine, and you've got there's dormouse in that box. In fact, that's why I took that picture, with a bit of bracken and closing canopy there. So 100% self-seeded, 12 or 15 stems per square metre. Not finding dormice in there. There is nothing else there, even though it's young pine. We found dormice on the very edge, but not in the middle. So what do dormice dislike? Don't really look at the left-hand end of what we all know dormice like. Think of the unfavourable features that we've got in here. And then, how can we undo some of those? That's the key. What can we do to undo those? There are some we can do nothing about. If you've got waterlogged ground or history of very large clear fell areas that may be clearing 100 acres, even 100 hectares in 1 or 2 years, that's pretty tough for dormice in a conifer scenario. But some of these others, there are a few examples here of what one might be able to do to try and shift the balance back to less bad and more favourable status. The thoughtful approach, which also happens to be the legal approach, is find out first of all whether you've got dormice present. And fortunately for this audience, practically everybody knows they have dormice present. So that is a fortunate one. You then need to identify for any operations in your woodland, I mean any operations in your woodland, what the implications are of doing those operations for dormice. And modify your activities, partly on account of best practice guidelines, but modified by your own particular situation as to what to do. Now for economic forestry, with our big horrid machines, we're talking of managing in the presence of dormice. We want to maintain dormice within this woodland while we take economic amounts of timber out in a sensible way. For wildlife groups, if that's not being a patronising term, and it's not meant to be, you could actually possibly get the resources to enhance that area for dormice, which is the subject of the talk that Ian so kindly sent me. So we've got to remember it's a protected species. Sometimes a license may be required, not a handling license, but a license to disturb dormice and follow best practice guidelines. How do we manage management? Well, what is the objective? Write down your objective. It's actually legally becoming more and more important. Are you dealing with part of a wood, the entire wood? Is it once over or over the next 10 or 20 years? What are the economics involved? We said labour, volunteer labour or contractors involved. And what are the landowners' other objectives, whether it be butterflies, shooting or any other particular species that they happen to be interested in. Natterjack toads, for example. So you want to enhance your meta-population at the local level, even if you may only have access to one piece of woodland. You're wanting to plan to increase your future quality and quantity of good habitat. And that's the key, because conifer is a suboptimal habitat in general terms. We'd all agree with that. But you must be pragmatic. You can't just micromanage and ignore everything, including the economics, the problems of wind throw, wind trees blowing over, soils issue, you can't get on the ground for some of the year, tree diseases are well in the fore at the moment, and Wales has got to cut down, 5,500 hectares of larch this winter, just to keep abreast of an impending disease scenario. That's huge quantities of stuff, and they've got to do it very quickly indeed. But our best practice guidance is telling you to ensure that your harmful actions, cutting a tree down may kill a dormouse, just remember that, takes full account of the conservation of the species and the population concerned. So I would interpret we're talking about the whole wood rather than just the little piece you're doing. When to cut conifers? When do you cut conifers? What's the best time? Spring? Hibernating? Desperately trying to find food that's come out? Midsummer, when they were breeding? Early autumn, when you've got second litters? Late autumn, they're desperately trying to feed up and don't want anything disturbed so they can get their food. And in winter, they're hibernating. So the answer is never. There's never a good time. So what do we do? And that's the conundrum. Not only a legal conundrum, but a practical conundrum. But in conifers in particular, no intervention is not an option. For broadleafs, quite often you can leave them for 10 years while somebody else thinks what to do about it. But in conifers, you really have to go in, otherwise you will remove your dormice. A few forestry terms, which is why this gets complicated, and I hope I'm going to keep this in time. Harvesters and forwarders, big machines. A compartment, a huge area of a forest. There may be 3 or 4 compartments in a forest. Each compartment may have 3, 5, 10 coops, smaller areas that are individual management units. A rack is a row of trees that have been planted that is usually removed in order for the big machinery to get in and do its work. To fell is fairly obvious, but to thin is in fact to take out a proportion of trees throughout your woodland. Thinning to waste means you're going to make no money at all. You're just going to dump all that timber on the ground and leave it. And if you leave it, you've got an increased amount of what we call brash, which is just the rubbish trees, the rubbish branches, etc., in a heap or somewhere on the ground that some poor sod's got to walk through unless it gets mashed up and turned into pulp, which is another problem. You've got halo and crescent thinning, which I haven't got time to go into. The bat people get het up about that. And then this idea of enrichment planting. You either plant lots of trees or you leave for regeneration an area that's been cut, or else you do what we call enrichment. You put a few trees in per hectare rather than 10,000 trees per hectare, and you know you're going to get something that you want coming up later. The other forestry term is profit, which actually, for much of woodland, is actually very important. So for restructuring conifers, which is what we're really talking about, you can clear fell large areas, 1 up to 25, some even bigger, hopefully not in dormouse areas. Group felling is taking a small patch, like the size of this part of the audience here, and take that out, and another 50, 70 yards, you take another little patch out. You've got little groups array across the forest block that you're interested in on that time. Selecting means you're taking that tree, and that tree, and that tree, and that tree, because those are the valuable ones, and you wander around and pick up those trees and take those out. And then you've got a shelter wood where it's almost the same as group felling. You're taking patches out because of landscape considerations, so you're periodically opening up the canopy to get light and regeneration. And all of these encourage a multi-age, what we call continuous cover forest, which in a way is probably what we really want for dormice. The forest operations potentially impacting on dormice, all of them virtually. Clear felling, thinning, extracting the timber, what you do with the brash, the preparation for replanting, whether you plant or regeneration, non-tree operations, tracks and such like, emergency work like the diseases, and conversion to open ground or pushing woodlands over to make more heathland for butterflies and reptiles and such like. I can't go through all of these, it would take most of the day. But in clear fell, you're talking about what area are we talking about in relation to other coops where dormice may or may not be happy, what proportion of the refuge is left. Similarly with thinning, overall thinning or little small groups, what's left untouched. How do you extract the timber? When do you do it? Where do you put these piles of logs? 400, 500, 1,000 tons of logs have got to be put somewhere and then taken away. Have the dormice hibernated on the edge of those? If they're left for a year, are the dormice going to make nests in the vegetation, the brambles and things that are growing up into those log piles? They're all things just to consider. Considering work in forests, there is something called the UK Woodland Assurance Scheme, and if you're taking any sizable amount of timber out at all, unless it's really tiny like that, anything bigger than that, you may well have to have a tree felling licence from the Forestry Commission. Whoever you are, whatever you are, if it's bigger than that, you may well need a licence. So the simple strategic restructuring, knowing that dormice do use conifers, is this. They prefer the younger stages of conifers. They will utilise old 100-year-old conifers, but they prefer the younger stages. Where you can, in your restructuring, retain most of the broadleaves that you can. And progressively, and the answer has to be progressively over years, create a matrix of gaps and glades and small fells to counter the shading that most conifers will ultimately create or have created in the woodland you're looking at. Clear proportionately, which is basically only a small proportion of your whole contiguous piece of woodland. If you want to take out a whole coop, then take out a whole coop, as long as it's a small proportion of your whole woodland. Encourage by your actions a diverse range of shrubs and tree species, whether it's planting or natural regeneration or this enrichment idea of planting a few hazels. If you all get together with the Woodland Trust, you might be able to get a small patch there. Improve the rides and edge structure where you can, but try to retain cross connections. I've seen these planners of forests, certainly in the Commission, who say, well, we need to make this ride a bit bigger, so we'll take a straight line and we'll go there for 3/4 of a mile, like that, back 20 metres. And you say, well, if you just made it a bit wavy, and there's a tree there that's almost touching the tree there, just leave those two. Oh, that's not a problem, they say. But they haven't thought about it. It's just easy for them to say, dead straight line. not rocket science, just practicality. And the last one, keep out all domestic herbivores and manage deer impact. Impact is the word, and I leave you to decide what you do about that. There are different options, but do address it, please. We cannot prevent deaths and disturbance, especially in the short term. As I say, felling 2 trees may kill 2 dormice, so you've broken the law. Timing, when do we do it? You're not supposed to be doing it during the first breeding period of the dormice in summer. You can do a chunk in autumn, September, October, and the previous guidance said you can do small operations in winter time, but the new guidance that hasn't yet been quite finalised is inferring a bit of a problem over this word winter, and I'm happy for somebody from Natural England to help me there. And in poor habitat, where people don't think there are dormice, really don't think there are dormice, you can work at any time at all. The scale of the woodland actions you do, about 1/3, or 2/3 for felling or thinning. The pattern preferably in a patchwork, and don't return to the same area until at least 5 years later. And you will get better habitat and probably better population over time. And if you follow the best practice guidelines, you should not need a licence from Forestry Commission / Natural England to do this work. Conifer clear fells, there's a small proportion in patchwork. Progressive autumn felling, important, directionally fell towards your refuge. Don't just start in the middle. Directionally fell to where you think dormice might still go. Leave the bigger broadleaves if you can. The rubbish will grow up and they'll be available again. Coppice or pollard small broadleaves that are in the way, because if you're using harvesters, you need to be get about and you end up with lots of little trees that looking like this, that are 15 metres tall and thin as your wrist. Deal with them. Adapt the brash, the rubbish treatment according to your site, and consider putting more trees in. Plan to retain connectivity across the forest. Critically important during our first best practice documentation. Whether it remains in the next version, I'm not sure. If you've got a huge woodland with connections, you're talking about 1/3 of your whole woodland. If you isolate it to this little chunk, it's 1/3 of that little chunk. So remember that. Patchwork with strips and areas. Retain or encourage your shrub layer. I'm having to hurry now, I'm afraid. And try to reduce your wider impact. Pollard is a dirty word and looks horrible to many people. It's cutting small broadleaves off at about this high, but it means the sheep and the deer don't eat it, so it comes up looking like a horrible lollipop, but it produces food and shelter for dormice. If you cut it down to the ground like that and the deer eat it, it will produce no food and it will produce no shelter. Or you make sure you've got no deer. It's up for you. So here we've got some habitats in our conifer woodland, regrowing after being cut, even better regrowing after being cut, and here we've got the typical thinning situation, which is not terribly good. And you can measure how the regeneration is going, at least Sarah managed to as part of her project, thank goodness. And we found that if you do these small group fells, you get quite a lot of regenerating index of material. If you do the traditional thinning through the big machines working the normal way, you get much worse. And if you choose to make the whole place look like a coppice, and Simone will be talking about that, if you choose it as coppice, you actually end up with quite good vegetation. So we suggest that the traditional thinning is not good for dormice in conifers. Here we're talking about hibernation nests, and here we put in little balls, and then the people got on with all their felling activities, and we just recorded what happened to these nests. Basically, most of them are crushed or severely damaged. However, in these two, which were little group fells, there's plenty of gaps for regeneration. In the thinning, full thinning, there are no gaps for regeneration. In here, the coppice area, you've got very good regeneration, but silviculturally, the rest of your trees that are left become poorer in quality. So again, the full mechanised thinning with the big machines is not such a good idea. And there's an example of what it looks like, which is not too brilliant. Here is an example with the areas with the brash, the lops and tops, put in rows that, when it gets grown through, provide corridors for dormice. Very quickly, a site in there, Vernditch site, one of the biggest dormice sites in that list, that thing. Hello, thank you. We showed keep the perimeter. Don't break the perimeter if you possibly can. It allows animals to get around. If you're allowed to clear a third, there's 1/3, there's 1/3, there's 1/3. No, don't do that. Consider doing it like that. Okay, and then in 0 seconds, we've got an area down here that we did a clear fell on, and that's what it looked like before we clear felled. There it is. Those are the refuges. How did we clear fell this triangle? The answer is you start in the middle and work outwards. The antithesis of a wheat field. Push outwards, so you're pushing all animals into your refuge. And there's the edges and what it looks like some years later, and all that shown by the use of microchips. I'm going to miss all of those because I can't. So you must agree with your woodland owner, who may be yourselves, it may be somebody else. Adapt to the best practice legal guidance, record your argument, and tell your operatives. But it must be a practical, pragmatic piece of work, and it will cost. Ask the Forestry Commission for advice, and that's their website.